Good day. Today is Tuesday, 5th August 2025, and there's been a lot of news over the last 24 hours. Important news, including from the Ukrainian battlefields, but it is to other matters that I'm going to turn attention to and start this program with. The first is that yesterday, Russia confirmed that it is no longer going to abide by the self-imposed restrictions it placed upon itself to abide by the terms of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, this is a treaty that had been agreed in 1987 between the then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and President Reagan of the United States, which basically abolished an entire class of nuclear weapons of that period. These were missiles with what were called intermediate nuclear range. The SS-20s, possessed by the Soviet Union, the Pershing and cruise missiles, possessed by the United States. I should actually correct that. The United States continued to retain Tomahawk cruise missiles, but it no longer operated land-based Tomahawk cruise missiles based in Britain and the Netherlands, and the Pershing intermediate range ballistic missiles that the United States forward positioned in West Germany was scrapped. And this treaty was controversial, especially in the Soviet Union, because the Soviets not only did away with the SS-20s, but with other shorter range or older missiles, which it was felt had a battlefield use and could not be classified as intermediate range missiles in the first place. And incidentally, there was also a view in the Soviet Union at that time that it was anyway inappropriate to scrap intermediate range nuclear weapons possessed by the Soviet Union, whilst Britain and France retained their independent deterrence. But anyway, there was a controversial treaty when it was agreed. It was widely seen at the time as a major step forward towards peace, consolidating the improvement in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was taking place at that time, paving the way for further nuclear disarmaments in the succeeding START treaties, and also a major step towards the eventual end of the Cold War. So this was a landmark treaty. Some years ago, during Donald Trump's first term, the United States pulled out of it. They were claiming that that Russia, was no longer abiding by its terms. They were specifically singling out a modified version of the Iskander missile, which was able to launch cruise missiles. They said that this encroached upon the treaty, that its range, the range of this system, made it an intermediate nuclear missile, and therefore that its creation violated the treaty. The Russians at the time heatedly denied this claim. They offered to the United States inspections of this system, and the United States, to my dismay at the time, refused that offer of inspection. It continued to insist that the missile, that the Iskander variant in question, violated the terms of the treaty, and therefore it said that it was no longer bound by the treaty anymore. I'm going to state my own view, which is that largely upon the fact that the United States refused this offer to inspect this missile, which it said violated the treaty, the missile in question, the modified Iskander that the United States was complaining about, was just an excuse by the United States to pull out of the treaty, which from the US perspective at that time had lost its usefulness. And the major reason, in my opinion, why the United States chose to do that at that time was not because it wanted so much to install intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe, though probably that was already on some people's agendas in Washington, but rather because they wanted to forward position intermediate nuclear missiles within reach of the Chinese mainland, something which, by the way, we're now starting to see, and the INF Treaty stood in the way of doing that. Anyway, the Russians said at the time that even though the United States was pulling out of the treaty, Russia itself would continue to abide by it in the hope, presumably, that the Americans would eventually come round. Well, the Americans have shown no interest in doing that. They've now developed the Typhoon system, which is a means to transport Tomahawk cruise missiles on a launch vehicle, a mobile truck-drawn launch vehicle. The Russians, in their latest announcement, have referenced the deployment of the Typhoon, which Germany has now shown an interest in acquiring. And I understand that steps have now indeed been taken by the United States to forward base intermediate nuclear weapons within range of China as well. The United States is also working on developing hypersonic missiles. These apparently would not carry nuclear warheads, but they're working on developing hypersonic missiles, which they will base in Germany, and which would also have the ability to reach Moscow. And some months ago, we did what I found an extremely upsetting article on the Duran, Glenn Deason, and myself with Professor Postel, in which he pointed out how the deployment of this system not only threatened the overall strategic balance between Russia and the United States, but would also threaten a decapitation strike against the Russian leadership. And the Russians obviously were very alarmed about that development. So, unsurprisingly now, the Russians have announced that they are no longer going to abide by the terms of this treaty. And this is linked, in my opinion, to several statements and actions that have been made by the Russians over the last couple of days. Now, in that post, which attracted so much attention and provoked the ire of US President Donald Trump, the vice chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, referred to the dead hand system that the Soviet Union, first the Soviet Union and now Russia, have developed, and no doubt massively updated since it was first designed and developed in the 1970s, whereby first the Soviet and then Russian leadership, if it was eliminated as a result of a decapitation strike, that would not prevent first the Soviet Union and then Russia from conducting immediate retaliation with the rest of its strategic forces. The system is complex. I'm not going to pretend I understand all its mechanics, and I'm not going to discuss those in this program. Anyway, it's seen as a foolproof system, whereby if there was a decapitation strike on Moscow, eliminating the leadership there, then automatically, without any further instructions, the entire Russian nuclear forces would be activated and would be launched against the United States, delivering a colossal retaliatory blow. So, just to say, Medvedev making that comment when he did, it seems to me, was also partly alluding to this decision by the Russians now to pull out, to stop their own self-abiding, their decision to abide by the terms of the already defunct Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the Russians, Medvedev, said that because I am fairly sure that the Russians do believe that this forward deployment of these hypersonic systems in Germany is indeed intended to make possible for the United States a decapitation strike against the Russian leadership, exactly in the way that Professor Postol was talking about in that program. The other step the Russians have taken, of course, over the last couple of days is that they have confirmed, or to be more precise, President Putin confirmed during the course of his meeting with President Lukashenko of Belarus at the monastery of Valam, they've confirmed that they're now deploying a hypersonic missile system, intermediate range hypersonic missile system of their own. That is, of course, the Oreshnik, which is an intermediate system. It has the ability to launch strikes against targets in Europe. It is currently intended for deployment in Belarus, and the Russians are now making further comments about further deployments of intermediate nuclear weapons that they might themselves decide to deploy at any time. And we've now had comments from Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman. He said Russia no longer has any constraints in this regard. Russia does not consider itself limited by anything anymore. Russia considers itself entitled to take relevant measures and steps if necessary. Now, that could be seen as a message from the Russians that just as the United States is planning to develop intermediate systems that can reach Russian territory, Moscow specifically, the Russians might start thinking about taking countermeasures of the same kind themselves. The Oreshnik does not carry a nuclear warhead. The system that the United States is apparently intending to install in Germany does not carry a nuclear warhead. I've already seen reports in the Russian media claim that Oreshnik missiles deployed in the Russian Pacific region would have a range to strike U.S. territory, not just Alaska, but further into California as well. Maybe the Russians are planning something similar, maybe an enhanced range Oreshnik, who knows? Or maybe they are planning forward deployment of these kind of missiles in some other way. I am not saying which way, and I'm not saying how. Obviously, some will speculate about forward deployment in Cuba. And given that the Oreshnik, by the way, is not a nuclear, does not carry a nuclear warhead, it might be debatable whether an Oreshnik deployed in Cuba would violate the agreements that were made between Khrushchev and Kennedy back in 1962. But I'm not saying that's going to happen, and obviously the Cubans would have a say in such a deployment, and they might not agree to that. But I do know, for example, that there have been discussions in Russia of developing a new class of submarines and nuclear submarines, and there's been some suggestions that this class of submarines, which goes by the codenamed Laika, a breed of Russian dog, by the way, that this class of Russian submarines might be capable of launching ballistic missiles, or perhaps to be more precise, hypersonic ballistic missiles. And, well, might that be the Oreshnik or something similar to it? Now, I say that because whilst Putin was in St. Petersburg attending the Navy Day celebrations last week, he heard a report from Nikolai Patrushev, the man who is in overall charge of Russia's submarine production, well, not just submarine, but naval construction program. And I noticed that whilst Putin spoke about accelerating production of Russia's current systems, current submarine systems, it's Yasen cruise missile submarine, it's Bore M ballistic strategic submarine, which has sea-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles of the Bulava class, the Lada class of conventional submarines. He also mentioned a new fifth generation submarine, which is apparently in development. And though, again, his words were extremely vague, I wonder whether that could be the Laika, and I wonder whether the plan, the Russian plan, is now to deploy it with hypersonic missiles. Anyway, all of this is becoming extremely alarming. It seems to me that not only are we now seeing the Russians starting to take countermeasures, given the collapse of the security system in Europe and given American plans to deploy medium-range missiles in Europe, hypersonic missiles in Europe. But there is no word, no sign at all that there is any agreement to move forward by Russia and the United States in connection with either an extension of the START Treaty, which covers strategic systems, or perhaps to negotiate a replacement to the START Treaty. Now, as I've discussed already, the START Treaty technically expires at the end of the year. President Trump recently spoke about it. He didn't seem to be, from what I could see, very interested in the question of whether or not to extend or negotiate the START Treaty. He seemed to speak about the fact that, it might be a good thing if it was extended, but it's clear that there are no talks underway currently to do so. I have to say that with all of these various steps that are being taken, it looks to me as if arms control between the superpowers is on the brink of complete collapse. And this Russian move basically takes us closer to that point. Now, of course, on top of that and beyond this, we are now talking about another superpower, which is China, which has industrial resources that dwarf those of the two old superpowers, the United States and Russia. It is building up its strategic forces at accelerating speed, and it too now has various hypersonic systems, including the hypersonic glide vehicle it tested about 2 years ago, about an intercontinental system that circumnavigated the Earth and which caused growing alarm within the Pentagon. And of course, we have what one might call the pocket superpower, North Korea, which is of course also now busy expanding its already existing strategic arsenal, and Kim Jong-un is now straightforwardly confirming that North Korea is indeed working on producing a nuclear-powered submarine, one which could potentially launch ballistic missiles. And of course, North Korea is in a position to threaten Japan and South Korea with such a system, but it could also potentially threaten the continental United States. It seems to me that we are drifting back into a situation similar to the one which existed in the early 1960s, at a time when films like Doctor Strangelove were made, where there is effectively no restriction on whatever system the various nuclear powers want to develop and put in production and deploy, except of course that it is a far more dangerous situation than the one which existed in the early 1960s, because there are more superpowers. In the early 1960s, there were just two. Now there are three. There are other countries like North Korea, as I said, which have intercontinental systems. There are countries like India and Pakistan, which, by the way, possess the capability to develop such intercontinental systems, should they be minded to do so, and which are, of course, already nuclear powers. And, of course, we have this very dangerous, very complex situation in the Middle East, where Israel is an undeclared nuclear power, and where there are, to put it mildly, questions about what Iran's intentions are with nuclear weapons. Iran continues to deny that it has any plans to develop nuclear weapons, but after the 12-day war, the possibility that they might do so objectively has increased. I am astonished, I am bewildered at how little interest there is in this topic. I would have thought that this would be a major point of discussion. I understand that the Russians are now in early deployment of the Belgorod nuclear-powered submarine and of the Poseidon submarine drone, nuclear-powered and carrying a nuclear warhead and able to do devastating damage against the shores of the United States. I discussed it some years ago in a program on this channel. I understand that the Russians are also working on other systems. The nuclear-powered cruise missile has been apparently a troubled program, but there's some claims that it has now got back on track. I'm not going to discuss that further, I don't know. But anyway, the point is, I think that it's a far more dangerous situation than in the 1960s. If nothing else, the relations between the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, in the 1960s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, began to improve. Now they are all deteriorating. We've had situations over the last year when missiles were launched with the assistance of one superpower, the United States, against the national territory of another superpower, Russia. This, of course, happened over the course of the conflict in Ukraine. Something that never happened at any time during the Cold War. And I have to say, not only is the complete collapse in the whole system of nuclear arms control and nuclear non-proliferation something which is incredibly dangerous, but the complacency, the insouciance which you find in the West on this topic absolutely astonishes me as somebody who lived through the Cold War. It leaves me incredulous. Anyway, that was one piece of very big news, which I think we learnt yesterday. As I said, you'll struggle to find any mention of it that I could see in the British and US media. I mean, there are a few places, if you look hard enough, you will find there is references to this Russian announcement, but nowhere is it headline news. Nobody in the West seems to be taking this seriously. I think they absolutely should. Anyway, that's one piece of news. The other piece of news is obviously potentially less consequential and momentous than the one I have just described, but it is not unimportant. I said in my program yesterday that it was becoming increasingly clear that the United States was surprised and infuriated and frustrated by the fact that all the US pressure to get India to stop buying Russian oil had been unsuccessful. I don't know what advice President Trump has been getting from his officials, from people like Keith Kellogg and Lindsey Graham and people like that. But I suspect that President Trump assumed that India would agree to the US demand and would stop buying Russian oil. A week ago, it became increasingly clear that President Trump was surprised that the Indians were refusing to accede to this demand, and that he was also surprised that the Indians were also resisting other demands being made by him and by the United States to open up India to imports of agricultural goods from the United States. I explained in a previous program why that would be a difficult thing for India to do, why a very large proportion of India's population still works in farming, or at least in what could be described as the rural economy and society, that this would be a devastating blow for them if India were at risk of being flooded by American agricultural imports, and that the Modi government would probably not be able to accede to this demand that was being made about it by the United States. Anyway, the Americans started to express their exasperation. Donald Trump published 2 posts on his Truth Social account last week. In the first, he still referred to India as a good friend. In his second post, which was published a short time later, about 2 days later, he took a harder stand. Then yesterday, I discussed really angry comments made by one of Donald Trump's officials, Stephen Miller, in which Stephen Miller complained about the fact that India was still buying Russian oil and was assisting thereby Russia's war machine. And well, yesterday, we got the final statement, the final comment from Donald Trump, and it appeared on Truth Social, and it reads as follows: India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are then, for much of the oil purchased, selling it on the open market for big profits. They don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. Because of this, I will be substantially raising the tariff paid by India to the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President DJT. So, no more references to India as a good friend. No more kind words about Prime Minister Modi who was previously seen as one of Donald Trump's friends. I think Trump is not only exasperated by the fact that India continues to buy Russian oil and refuses to import agricultural goods from the United States, but I think he's also becoming increasingly frustrated that his attempts to break up and disrupt the BRICS group, of which of course India is a key part, that those attempts are failing. So far, none of the core members of BRICS, Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, are bending to his demands. Anyway, the Indian government responded to Donald Trump's words yesterday. And the words were made in very measured and far more polite language, such as I would say befits a great power, by the official spokesperson of India's Ministry of External Affairs, Randir Jaiswal. India has been targeted by the United States and the European Union for importing oil from Russia after the commencement of the Ukraine conflict. In fact, India began importing from Russia because traditional supplies were diverted to Europe after the outbreak of the conflict. The United States at that time actively encouraged such imports by India for strengthening global energy markets stability. Now, this is a very interesting disclosure, by the way, and it was alluded to by unofficial comments provided by other Indian officials speaking anonymously to the Russian and American media. But it turns out that even as the Biden administration was telling the Europeans to stop buying Russian oil and gas, the Biden administration was telling India, please go ahead and buy Russian oil. We need you to buy Russian oil because otherwise, if you don't, a competition is going to start to develop between Europe and India and China, all trying to source oil, presumably from the Middle East, from the Gulf producers. And if that doesn't happen, then oil prices are going to skyrocket, and that's going to have a bad effect on the stability of global energy markets and will result in even higher inflation in the United States than is already the case. And of course, back in 2022, which is probably when the Americans were telling the Indians this, well, at that time, as I very well remember, inflation in the United States briefly hit 10%. It was at one time in double digits, as it was, by the way, for a certain period in much of Europe also. So even as the Biden administration was trying to restrict Russian oil exports, it was actually working to facilitate Russian oil exports. Only it didn't want them to go to Europe. It was trying to divert them to India and obviously, presumably, China also. Now, that, I think, tells you a great deal about the Biden administration, about Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, whoever it was who was making the decisions at that time. Even as they were making the lives of American and, I should say also, European consumers more and more difficult, even as they were preaching to the Europeans about the evils of buying energy products from Russia and thereby assisting the Russian war machine. At one and the same time, they were taking steps to try to stabilize energy markets in order to contain global inflation. Well, given all that we now know about the Biden administration, I have to say that doesn't surprise me in the least. And in some respects, I should say that the Biden administration at that time was acting with a lot more wisdom and understanding of the very precarious situation in global energy markets than, well, Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal, Keith Kellogg, and other people in the United States and some people in Europe seem to be acting now. Anyway, put all that aside, India has also pointed out that the trade between Russia and India has now grown to such a level. This isn't just the energy trade, but other parts of this trade have grown to such a level that it is simply no longer practical for India simply to switch it off. If that were to happen, it would have a seriously negative effect on the Indian economy. And besides, India cannot afford, given the realities of everyday life for hundreds of millions of people in India, it simply cannot afford higher energy costs, the kind of higher energy costs that would follow if India were to stop buying oil from Russia. So we see how the US, the calculations of people like Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal and Keith Kellogg and all of the others are already starting to go wrong. I don't believe that this is going to be the end of the story, by the way. I suspect that the Americans are going to continue their pressure on India to try to stop India buying Russian oil. I think the Indians will continue to buy Russian oil. I think the more the pressure grows from the United States, the more angry and frustrated the Indians are going to become. I think that already we're starting to see steps between India and China towards some kind of a rapprochement. And for the record, I believe that at some point in the next few months, if this pattern continues, we are likely to see some kind of emergency meeting of the BRICS states to decide what to do next. In the meantime, yesterday, I mentioned the fact that India has decided against buying F-35 fighter jets from the United States. There's been explanations about this, which I've been provided privately, by the way, why the F-35 would not be a good match for India at this time. This is not a comment about the technical qualities of the F-35, but about issues the Indians would have operating a fighter jet of that kind. But anyway, for the record, I suspect that one likely consequence of all of these moves, assuming relations between India and the United States and India and the European Union continue to deteriorate, is that India, which has been trying to diversify its arms imports, is going to turn back to that perennial, ultra-reliable supplier of weapons, a country that's been supplying India with weapons since the early 1960s, that played a key role back in the 1960s in building up India's own military industrial complex, that set up factories in India to produce fighter jets and tanks and those kind of things. The country that has never failed to supply India with whatever advanced weapons India needed, and which has always shown a willingness to share technology with India to an extent and a degree which no Western country has ever done. I am, of course, talking about Russia. Anyway, that's something for the future. I might be wrong about that, Of course, India today is a very different country from the country it was in the 1960s. It has a significant industrial and technology base of its own. It designs and manufactures its own fighter jets, the Tejas, for example. And for all I know, the Indians could be working or could decide to develop fighter jets of their own. But I personally would not be surprised if they were to go back to the Russians. And I've heard talk that India is once again showing interest in the Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jet that the Russians are deploying. And I would not be surprised if at some point or other we get an order and perhaps an agreement on joint production in India, and talk is that the Indians still want a two-man model of this aircraft. Please don't ask me to explain what the rationale for that is. But anyway, it could be that that's what we're going to see at some point before very long. Anyway, there it is. Now, that leaves the other countries that continue to import Russian oil. One of them, of course, is Turkey. Turkey imports energy products from Russia on a very big scale. It imports gas through Turkstream, which it then re-exports to Europe. It imports other goods, other energy products from Russia as well. It's likely to want to continue to import goods from Russia. But President Erdogan is nothing if not an agile, nimble leader in these situations. He has forged ahead, developing ever closer relations, economic relations with Russia. He imports nuclear technology from Russia. He attracts investment from Russia. He has the Russians building, well, one nuclear power plant that they've completed, and apparently there's now plans to build yet another. But at the same time, he exports weapons to Ukraine. He negotiates free trade agreements with Ukraine. He speaks about his support for Ukraine. And of course, he is now apparently planning a visit to Ukraine where he's going to meet President Zelensky and no doubt reiterate his support for Ukraine's eventual NATO membership and do all of those things. Now, if you think that this has nothing to do with all of these tariff threats from the United States, then I have a bridge to sell you. Of course it does. This is exactly what President Erdogan does. And in this case, I can't fault him. I expect that we were going to get all of this rhetoric from Erdogan in Kiev. We're going to have all of those pictures. They're going to come out soon. And I suspect that the United States is going to hold back from imposing punitive secondary tariffs on Turkey as a result of this. Nothing in reality, of course, will change. The relationship between Russia and Turkey will remain as always, but President Erdogan knows what in this kind of situation he needs to do, and of course, he's now going to do it. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to say about Turkey. The other big power is, of course, China. And this is now where we have the other very big piece of news. And this relates to rare earths. Now, we've had a situation in the spring where China and the United States were briefly imposing economic blockades against each other. And I remember how frustrated President Trump was that he wasn't getting calls from President Xi Jinping of China, and that the Chinese didn't seem to be capitulating to his demands. Anyway, we've heard nothing more of that, but we did have two successive meetings between the Americans and the Chinese, one in Geneva, one in London. Then there was a follow-up meeting which took place about a week ago in Stockholm. There's been no overall overarching agreement between China and the United States on trade questions. President Trump has at times suggested that there has been, but it's clear that we've not had any final trade agreement between China and the United States. And reports have been circulating that the United States has agreed to another 90-day cooling off period before tariffs on China resume at the same level that we saw in the spring, and that the United States is extremely nervous about reimposing those kind of sanctions because things that happened in the spring. Firstly, the restriction on imports from China was starting to affect the number of products that were appearing in US stores. There were reports that American retailers like Walmart were warning that it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain stocks of goods in the shops because stocks were running out. Well, presumably those stockpiles have now been rebuilt over the last couple of weeks, and there is probably some scope for maneuver here. But if we get back into a 100% tariff situation, inevitably at some point, probably next year, this problem will come back again. But the other concern, one which gave rise almost to panic, is that China stopped exports to the United States of rare earths. And there were reports circulating, which I remember reading in the Financial Times in the spring, that supply chains were starting to gum up because there weren't rare earths, that this is beginning to affect the automobile industry in the United States, that manufacturing was on the brink of a major crisis because of the shortages of rare earths and of critical magnets that only China produces, and the entire industrial supply chain was on the brink of completely ceasing up. Well, as I said, we have had no hint so far of any tariff announcement from the United States about China, or of any action against China if it continues to import Russian oil, which of course it will. The Chinese have already made it absolutely clear that they are not going to be influenced by the United States or by Lindsey Graham or by Donald Trump or by Keith Kellogg or by anybody like that. They're going to continue to import Russian oil in the same volumes as always. They might even increase those volumes, and that they are looking to increase imports of Russian natural gas also. Anyway, what we have now learned is that China is still restricting exports of rare earths to the United States, despite the pauses that we saw, despite the meetings in Geneva, London, and Stockholm, and that the Chinese are imposing licenses on buyers, American buyers of rare earths, and that in particular they are restricting exports of rare earths to the US military industrial complex. And according to the Wall Street Journal, this is now starting to create panic within the military industrial complex, that there is now a scramble to find magnets and rare earths from every other possible source. China has an overwhelmingly dominant position in this sector. So what that basically must mean is that stockpiles around the world are being raided in order to keep production going. And that the ability to do that is gradually becoming exhausted, and that this is having an effect on US production of weapons, of military items. Now, we've not yet seen any visible sign of this. And of course, when these kind of crises hit, there is always the scope for enormous amounts of improvisation, and corners start to get cut and all kinds of things to keep production running. But over time, it begins to take its toll. So missiles, I mean, what I'm going to say now is to some extent speculative, but not that far speculative. But missiles are going to be produced with less effective components, with less good components. F-35s are going to find problems as well. Apparently the restrictions extend beyond rare earths as well, by the way. Things like gallium arsenide, which is used apparently for the processors that are used for the special radars that the F-35s operate. Anyway, all of these things. Now, of course, the United States, in time, can develop its own rare earths industries. It can make all of these products itself. But this inevitably is going to take time. Now, there have been many attempts by the United States over the last 20 plus years, especially the last 15, to rebuild its rare earths refining industry. None of these attempts have been especially successful. Perhaps priority could be given now. But even if we had a rushed program given the highest priority, I still understand that getting around this problem would take years. And, well, briefly, in this situation, the United States doesn't have those years. Now, inevitably, I said there's improvisations. Despite the system of licenses, I suspect that some rare earths that the Chinese are exporting and magnets are currently exporting are bleeding through to the US economy, to the military industrial parts of the economy. I suspect that they're being recycled in all sorts of ways. After all, there aren't Chinese inspectors on the ground in the United States. But if the Chinese stop all supplies, as they did in the spring, and if they extend this stop to Europe, as they also did in the spring, then I suspect that we will be in a crisis again, one which will start to manifest itself fairly quickly, perhaps over the course of weeks, maybe months. Now, what the United States is going to do about this, I don't know. What Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, if they're presuming they have any ideas about it, what they would propose to do about it, I don't know either. Knowing the sort of people they are, they will probably say that it is impossible that the United States could be held hostage in this way. After all, it is the United States. The United States can do anything. It is capable of achieving anything. It is impossible that what the Chinese can do, the United States cannot do. And they will not be interested in talk about industrial processes and refining technologies and things of that kind. They will insist that this is all done right away. We will have further proclamations about the importance of will and all of that. As I've said already in various places, willpower is a very overrated commodity. It's something that people really do believe that they can trade in defiance of logistics and capacities and facts. And of course, the neocons, like others, have made almost a cult of it. All I would say is it's not impossible if we get catapulted into a full-blown trade war, economic blockade between the United States and China, and if the Chinese do start restricting exports of rare earths and magnets in the way that they did in the spring, that we're going to start to see not just industrial production altogether collapse, with all the knock-on effects on the global and Western economy and the effects on inflation that would be bound to have, with money chasing fewer and fewer goods. But we would also start to see, presumably, a significant decline in weapons production. Now, this at a time when American inventories are already depleted because of the war in Ukraine, when the Europeans are saying they want to buy from the Americans weapons to arm Ukraine. Again, has anybody thought about what this means? Are we going to be buying weapons? The Dutch, by the way, have been the first to put up money to buy weapons from the United States. They've said they're going to provide $500 million to buy weapons to the United States, a significant amount of money, even for a rich country like the Netherlands. And I would point out that in the last parliamentary election in the Netherlands, the one in which Geert Wilders' party did rather well, a sentiment seemed to be gaining ground in the Netherlands against continuing to supply money and weapons and those kind of things to Ukraine. But obviously that isn't going to affect the decisions. But anyway, has anybody thought about the wisdom of sending still more weapons to Ukraine at a time when bottlenecks caused by the denial of rare earths and specialized magnets might mean that replacing those weapons is going to become more difficult, because those bottlenecks are going to start to get greater? Has anybody in Washington or in Brussels or in London or Berlin or Paris or The Hague thought about this? Have they sat down and considered what it means? Already, apparently, there are problems with drone production, not just in Ukraine, but across much of the West, because the Chinese have started to restrict supplies of goods to make cheap drones. Just saying. Of course, rare earths and magnets would amplify the problem by orders of magnitude. Anyway, I'm just mentioning all of this. Perhaps somebody has thought about this. Perhaps they have some plan. If they do, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's all deeply classified so that the Chinese don't find out. But I'm going to guess that there is no plan. I've never got the impression that there has been a plan at any point since the special military operation began in February 2022, when the West first started to unroll its various sanctions and started to engage in economic warfare. I've never got the sense that any plan existed, and I suspect that there is still no plan now. The only plan that we see is endless improvisation, of which, of course, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal's bone-crushing sanctions bill is a case in point, and which Donald Trump, under Keith Kellogg's urging, has apparently now, at least in some form, adopted. Anyway, there we go. So, an important 24 hours. The whole system of nuclear arms control is starting to break down. We now see the United States drifting into an economic confrontation with India, which could very well cause a growing rapprochement between India and China, and one where India might decide to source still more of its weapons from Russia and deepen its economic and political and strategic relationship with Russia, and one where the United States could find itself drifting into an economic confrontation with China, the implications of which I suspect it has failed still to think through. I'm just going to finish by making one further point here. If the United States backs off tariffs, imposing these stellar tariffs against China, if it treats India more harshly than it has treated China, and so far, and I want to say this, we've had no confirmation from President Trump of how high he intends to impose further tariffs on India. So it may be that when he says that he's going to punish the Indians, it may be that he might not punish them by very much. But if the United States does start to punish India more than it is punishing China, then I suspect this is not going to go down well in India at all. The whole point about the development of the relationship between the United States and India that has taken place over the last 10 or so years is that India has been seeking to hedge its complex relations with China by developing better relations with the US, whilst the US has been developing its relations with India in order to use India to counterbalance China. If, in spite of all of that, the US backs down and doesn't impose tariffs on China at the same level that it is imposing tariffs on India, for all the reasons, the very strong, good reasons that I've just said, the Indians will feel that they're gaining absolutely nothing, that they gain absolutely nothing through forging a relationship with the United States. It's not proved any kind of hedge against China at all. It makes better sense, therefore, to build closer relations within the BRICS, seek some kind of détente with China, and rely on Russia instead as the hedge. And as for the United States, well, of course, to the extent that it saw India as a card it could play in its poker game against India, it will have just sacrificed that card. I'm just saying. Anyway, that's what I want to say about all of this situation. Now, there is one other thing that I want to talk about, which is now Iran, because we're getting some further information. I'm getting some further information. Well, some of it is in open sources, some is not, about things that the Iranians might be deciding to do. The first is that the Iranian authorities have made clear over the last day that despite the fact that they will receive a delegation from the IAEA in Tehran next week and will have discussions with the IAEA next week, any idea of inspections of Iranian nuclear facilities by any third party is now absolutely ruled out. Now, third party obviously includes the IAEA, but I'm going to suggest it probably also excludes countries like China and Russia as well. The Iranians have probably been approached by the Russians, who have again floated this idea of a deal Putin has had another conversation with Netanyahu, which I have not yet had the opportunity to examine the readout carefully. But apparently the Russians have been floating some kind of an idea for some kind of deal to be done concerning Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And it may be that this has suggested some kind of inspection regime of Iranian facilities, perhaps carried out by Russia. But my own understanding of what the Iranians are now saying is that they are not interested and will not agree to any inspections of their nuclear sites by anyone at all, by the IAEA, by Russia, by China, by anyone else. After what happened in the 12-day war, I cannot say I am surprised by this. Now, that is one piece of news. There is another piece of news which has attracted absolutely no attention at all, but it seems that Iran has now established within the Iranian system, the political system, a new body called the Defense Council. Now, Iran has a very complex political system, as I've discussed in many programs. There is a whole elaborate structure directly answerable to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. There are other structures as well. And there is already some kind of Security Council, though this is apparently an immense, very elaborate, very cumbersome structure, which involves lots and lots of different people, and it operates very slowly, and it meets rarely, and when it does meet, it's impossible to keep the facts secret. And of course, we've seen that the Israelis have a capacity and a willingness to conduct decapitation strikes when bodies like this meet. Well, the new structure, which is called the Defense Council, is apparently much smaller. We're not told who will be its members, but this will be a very small, tightly knit group of people, and it is going to have overall charge of the Iranian defense and military and security system. A streamlining of what was shown during the 12-day war to be an overcomplicated, fragmented system. Perhaps was long overdue, but it looks like it's happened. Now, of course, this is not just a response to the 12-day war. It must be seen also as a preparation for the next step in the ongoing conflict with Israel and the United States, which the Iranians are clearly indicating they expect to resume at some point with further strikes against their country. Anyway, that's one thing. The second is that there's been a massive article in the Financial Times about how Iranian nuclear scientists were involved in trying to obtain nuclear technology from Russia. This is all centers on a trip by Iranian nuclear scientists to Russia, which took place last year. The article goes into massive detail about all kinds of things, but never ultimately provides anything that could be even remotely described as a smoking gun. It talks about the fact that these nuclear scientists went in kind of conditions of semi-secrecy, that their flight to Russia was disguised in some ways, but I don't find that in itself suspicious, given the fact that the Israelis have for many years now been busy trying to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. I would have thought that it would be a basic precaution by the Iranian authorities to try to keep the movements of these people as secret as possible. In fact, the problem that the 12-day war showed from an Iranian point of view is that the movements of these people was not secret enough. And as for the technologies that these Iranian scientists were seeking to access in Russia, the Financial Times article admits that all of the technologies in question are what might be described as dual-use technologies. They could all be legitimate technologies that Iran might legitimately want to buy and use as part of its civilian nuclear program. Some might have potential military applications if Iran was heading towards developing a nuclear weapon, but it's far from conclusive. Anyway, the point is that contacts between Russia and Iran on nuclear technologies are ongoing, and perhaps they have a more granular quality than we knew, and it's likely that that has continued. It would also, by the way, I would have thought all of these contacts, that they would mean that the Russians do have considerable knowledge about Iran's nuclear enrichment program, simply through their dealings with the Iranians, putting aside the question of Russian inspection of any Iranian nuclear sites. Just saying. Now, the third piece of information that I've received is perhaps the most interesting, and again it comes from a source, and the source is accessing the information from within Russia. And again, this is a reliable source. I am not going to discuss further about the source. What I will say is this. It seems that for some months now, since before the 12-day war, there have been Iranian military officers or personnel in Russia training on S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems. Apparently, this training program has been underway for some months. It looks as if it's intended to result in exports of these advanced missile systems to Iran. There's no word that this has been accelerated or enhanced in any way since the 12-day war. I would stress this apparently started to happen before the 12-day war took place. Apparently the Russians have the Russian view is that it takes about a year for students on these systems to learn to use them effectively, and about 2 years for them to use them proficiently. So we are probably quite some time away from the point when these systems finally start to become deployed and become effective. But it looks as if this work is already underway, and it's likely that those rumors that we heard back in August about S-400 deliveries to Iran were based on confusing information about the fact that Iran was sending military personnel to train, or had decided at that time to send military personnel to train on using these systems in Russia. Now, the Chinese authorities have now apparently officially denied that there are any plans by China to supply JC-10 fighter jets to Iran. But I understand that the long saga of the Sukhoi 35 in Russia is still ongoing. it might be that the reason that the Sukhoi 35s have not yet been deployed to Iran is because there are pilots, Iranian pilots, in Russia currently training on those systems as well, on those aircraft as well. Now, Brian Beletic, in his many programs, has pointed out how long it takes to train pilots and ground personnel to integrate advanced aircraft like it was the F-16 in the case of Ukraine, but certainly the Sukhoi 35, which is a significantly more advanced fighter jet than the F-16, that it takes a long time to train personnel to use these weapons. And he also says that he also speaks about how this can take years, and it may be that the delays in the supply of the Sukhoi 35s and of the S-400s are partly because this is a complex program, and it may take years to start producing results. Maybe we won't start to see deployments before late 2026, 2027. And if this is correct, then that might explain some of the things that have happened over the last year. Because if the Israelis got wind in August that the Iranians and the Russians were going to work together in this way, then that of course means that Israel has only a limited time window before the Iranian air defense system starts to develop to a point where it might become seriously effective. And that might explain the pressure from the Israelis late last autumn to launch strikes against Iran, why the Israelis did launch strikes against Iran in June, and in fact the whole story of the 12-day war. I suspect that the contacts between the Russians and the Israelis that we are seeing between Putin and Netanyahu partly center on this information, which, by the way, I ought to make clear, I consider extremely reliable. I trust this particular source. This is the most confirmed information I have seen so far of the Iranians and the Russians cooperating on air defense matters. It seems to me that the Israelis probably know about it. I suspect the Americans know about it as well. And I suspect that this is, as I said, partly the reason why the Israelis are reaching out to the Russians in the way that they are. So, as I said, lots of interesting news, lots of interesting developments. We see how the chess pieces, if you like, continue to move along the board of global affairs. The Americans are moving some of them rather clumsily. Others are taking countermeasures. To repeat again, all of the actions that I've talked about so far, taken by the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, are countermeasures to moves that the Americans and their allies have been taking. And we could see how, potentially at least, the aggregate effect of all of these countermeasures will negate or could negate what the Americans and their allies are hoping to achieve, and might ultimately cause many more problems for the Americans beyond that. Anyway, here I must say something, which is that, like many people in the United States, I was incredulous to learn that it is now apparently seriously proposed and apparently decided by the administration, by the president, that localities and regions in the United States might be denied disaster relief if their local governments support various positions against Israel. As many people are pointing out, that is not America first, that is America last. It's one of the succession of increasingly bad decisions that the president has been making since June, which are putting further and further stress on the loyalty of his base. That obviously is true. I have to also say that as a statement of American policy at this time in the Middle East, when Israel is coming under criticism, justified criticism, justified is not a strong enough word for it. But anyway, criticism of Israel. Israel has been criticized as never before. It seems to me an extraordinary thing to choose to do. Anyway, I've left less time today, in fact very little time, to discuss military developments in Ukraine, but there has in fact been some information. Firstly, the Russians have now confirmed that again, one of the major air bases that they attacked with Kinzhal missiles was the Staro-Konstantinov air base, where the F-16s and the Mirage 2000s are said to be concentrated. I don't know anything about the results there. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Russian-backed Donetsk regional government, has given an interview to Russia 24, in which he's talked about the situation in Pokrovsk. He says, if we talk about Pokrovsk, the enemy has been largely denied the possibility to deliver ammunition and carry out troop rotations. Nonetheless, it is too early to say that Pokrovsk has been tightly and fully encircled, which accords with the information that I have. There are still escape routes, but the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk cannot be reinforced or resupplied anymore. He says that the situation in Mirnograd is worse. He says that the Ukrainian army's basic supply routes to Mirnograd have been cut off after Russian troops captured Novoekonomichne, and the enemy is now in such a situation where it is difficult even to retreat, even if it wishes so very much. So he's saying that the Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd are effectively surrounded, are trapped. The Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk are not yet trapped, but they are not able any longer to receive supplies, ammunition and food presumably, and oil products and other things that militaries need if they are going to keep fighting. And of course, they're not able to receive reinforcements either. This, of course, reinforces the impression that, as I said, the situation in Pokrovsk is coming close to the point of crisis now. Pushilin has also said things about Chasiv Yar. He says that some time will be required to complete the mop-up operation in Chasiv Yar. However, it is a matter of days or perhaps even weeks to say that this settlement has been fully cleared of the enemy, which is, by the way, a way of admitting that there are still some Ukrainian holdouts in Chasiv Yar itself, even if the town is now securely under Russian control. He says that a mine clearance effort will begin in Chasiv Yar after it is fully cleared of these enemy holdouts. He said that the Ukrainian military placed large numbers of military headquarters on the territory of Chasiv Yar. The town was protected by several defensive lines and the natural water barrier, the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct. But it is now, as I said, securely under Russian control. So that's what he said. Now, there's been also some reports, some very interesting reports, about the situation in Siversk. The Russian channels, and I believe Ukrainian channels also, though I haven't seen this, are acknowledging that the Russians have captured a hamlet called Novosilka and the fortified positions around Novosilka. Now, Novosilka is difficult to find on maps. It is a tiny place, but it is located between Verkhokamyanska, the village of Verkhokamyanska, and Siversk itself. If the Russians do indeed hold Novosilka, and it seems that they do, and the fortified positions around it, then they are literally on the doorstep of Siversk itself. Apparently, Ukrainian mapping projects are now saying that Serebianka, the village to the north of Siversk, is in the grey zone. And when the Ukrainians say that, that is usually an indication that Serebianka also is about to fall. Now, if this is correct, and I have no reason to doubt that it is correct, then Siversk is caught in a trap, in a salient. The Russians are immediately to the east, to the south, and to the north of it. And as I've discussed already, the Russians are apparently in the process of storming the village of Torske. In fact, they might have captured it by the time that this program is published, or there may be confirmation that they captured it by the time that this program is published. There is little chance now, it seems to me, of the Ukrainians recapturing it. And it is quite plausible that the Russians could push on south towards the next village to the south of Torske, which is Yampol, in which case Siversk is in effect in a cauldron. I don't think the Ukrainians will want that to happen, and I predict that before it does, they will withdraw. If they do withdraw from Siversk, then Liman, the next important city to the west, with the Russians already very close to Liman, as I said, they're currently apparently storming a village called Kolodizy, which is located to the northeast of Liman. And of course, Torske is not located far from Liman either, and neither is Yampol, by the way. Anyway, I cannot imagine that in that kind of situation, the Ukrainians would be able to hold on to Liman for very long. Liman would also fall. Whether the Ukrainians decided to defend it, if they've already lost Siversk, it's difficult to say. And then we would have a situation, the like of which we've never seen before, when the Russians controlled Liman in 2022, and by the way, Torske and Yampol as well. The Ukrainians were still in secure control of Siversk, and they had secure lines to Siversk because they controlled Solidar and Bakhmut. But the Russians, of course, now control Solidar and Bakhmut, and they control other positions well to the north of those places, and they would control Siversk also. Impossible to see, as far as I can see, either how Ukraine could defend Liman for very long if Siversk is lost, or how the Ukrainians could ever hope to recapture Liman and Siversk if this time they lose them again. And that will bring the Russians to the gates of Slavyansk and it will deepen the enormous operational crisis that the Ukrainians face in Donbass. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.